It was a cold morning in the fall of 1944 when the first train carrying German officers arrived at the American POW camp. The steam billowed into the gray sky as the train screeched to a halt on the tracks. The officers stepped off one by one, their stiff military uniforms showing signs of wear, their faces hard from the long journey and the uncertainty of what awaited them. The air was thick with the smell of iron and the distant echoes of war. But here, for the first time, they were on foreign soil, in a land they had never imagined they would see as captives. They stood in awkward silence, surveying their new surroundings, not knowing how their lives would change in this place. As they were led into the camp, the officers exchanged wary glances, their discipline keeping them in line, their minds racing with memories of combat and power. The American guards were professional, stoic in their demeanor, but there was a distinct tension in the air. For the German officers, this was not a typical battlefield. This was a strange, uncertain space where the rules were not theirs to dictate. They were not the ones in control, and that was a bitter pill to swallow. The pride they had carried for so long began to crack under the weight of captivity. They were ushered into the barracks, simple yet functional, and told to rest before their first meal. The walls of the building felt bare, almost clinical, stripped of the comforts they had grown accustomed to in their officers' quarters. The beds were uncomfortable, the blankets thin, but at least they were warm. Yet, despite the physical comfort they were given, the mental and emotional toll of being prisoners began to settle in. Each man tried to maintain a facade of composure, but beneath it, the anxiety of uncertainty began to gnaw at them. How long would they be here? Would they ever return to the front lines? These questions loomed, unanswered. The food was the next unknown. They were not sure what to expect, but given their situation, they had learned not to complain. The kitchen staff, mostly American civilians, worked quietly behind the scenes, preparing the meals for the prisoners. As the officers entered the mess hall for the first time, the smell of the food hit them, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. They had heard stories of American rations, but seeing it in person was different. The atmosphere in the hall was quiet, the officers unsure of what to do, their usual confidence replaced by a strange humility. When the trays were handed out, the officers sat down at the long wooden tables, their eyes scanning the unfamiliar food. The meal was simple: soup, some boiled vegetables, and the most curious item of all, a package of what appeared to be cheese. It was wrapped in plastic, something none of the officers had ever encountered. At first, it seemed like a joke. The plastic packaging, the color, it looked like something meant for children, not soldiers. But the camp's cook, an African-American man named Sam Washington, placed the packages on the table with a smile, eager to serve. One officer, who had been silent until then, took the first bite. He chewed slowly, and his face twisted in confusion. The texture was unlike any cheese they had known. It was soft and almost rubbery, with a taste that was both bland and oddly sweet. The officer pushed it away with a sneer, muttering something under his breath. Another officer, sitting across from him, laughed, his voice rising above the hum of the room. "What is this? It's not even real cheese," he said, his tone laced with mockery. The others joined in, their laughter ringing through the hall. They couldn't help it. It seemed so absurd. They were prisoners of war, sitting in an American camp, eating what appeared to be plastic. Sam, the cook, watched from the kitchen doorway, a hurt expression crossing his face. He had hoped this meal, prepared with care, would offer some comfort to the men, a small taste of home. But instead, his effort had been met with mockery. The laughter stung. It was not the laughter of fellow soldiers, but of men who, in their arrogance, could not comprehend the simple kindness behind the meal. It was an insult not only to the food, but to him as a person, as someone who had put his heart into preparing it. Sam stood there, trying to keep his composure, but the hurt was clear in his eyes. The officers continued to laugh, their voices echoing against the bare walls of the mess hall. To them, this was just another absurdity in the world they now inhabited. They had faced death, seen the horrors of war, and now they were reduced to mocking a strange, inedible meal. It seemed almost fitting. It was easier to mock something unfamiliar than to admit the uncomfortable truth. They were no longer in control. They were at the mercy of the Americans, and this plastic cheese was just another symbol of that powerlessness. As the meal ended and the officers returned to their barracks, the taste of the cheese lingered in their mouths, but so did the taste of bitterness. They had learned in a single moment that survival in this new world would be different from anything they had known before. They would have to adapt, not just to the food, but to everything. But for now, they could hold on to the one thing that had always given them a sense of power, their ability to laugh, even if it was at the expense of something as simple as a piece of American cheese. The first few days in the American POW camp were filled with uncertainty and confusion. The German officers, accustomed to a rigid structure and discipline, found themselves in an environment that seemed both surreal and unsettling. Their every move was watched by the American guards, who were professional but distant, maintaining an air of formal civility. The officers, though still carrying the weight of their rank and identity, were stripped of their previous sense of power. Their uniforms, once symbols of authority, now seemed to make them stand out even more as prisoners. Every glance exchanged between them spoke volumes, each man processing the situation in his own way, but all of them grappling with the same fundamental question: what now? The camp itself was a mix of old military buildings and newer constructions that seemed hastily thrown together. The barracks they were assigned to were functional but sparse, with little in the way of comfort. The beds were simple metal frames with thin mattresses, and the walls were bare, offering no sense of privacy or personal space. It was a far cry from the officers' quarters they had been used to in Germany, where each man had his own space, a sense of order, and a level of respect that was inherent to their rank. But here, they were all equal in their captivity, forced to live with the bare minimum. Days blurred into one another as the officers settled into the monotony of their new existence. The mornings began early with the sound of a loud whistle, followed by the clanging of metal as the guards went about their duties. The officers were expected to follow the same routine as the other prisoners, a routine that involved work details, physical exercise, and, of course, waiting. Waiting for news, for orders, for any indication of what the future might hold. The sense of time seemed distorted here, stretched out by the slow rhythm of life in captivity. Meals, though simple, were a constant reminder of their predicament. The food, while nutritious, was unlike anything they had encountered before. The soup was bland and watery, the vegetables overcooked, and the bread was tough and dry. It was nothing like the rich stews and meats they were used to back home. Yet they ate because they had no choice. The Americans had made it clear from the start that the food was part of the deal. In exchange for their safety and basic care, they would eat what was provided without complaint. It was during these meals that the officers began to notice something strange about the American way of life. Despite the absence of luxuries, there was an undercurrent of hospitality that they couldn't ignore. The guards, while firm and unyielding, offered small gestures of kindness: a warm cup of tea, a smile, a simple nod of acknowledgement. These were the things that began to make the officers wonder. They had been taught to believe that the Americans were their enemies, that they were ruthless and uncaring. Yet here in this camp, it was becoming clear that their captors were not the monsters they had imagined. In some ways, they were even more humane than their own commanders had been. One afternoon, a group of officers was summoned to the camp's central hall for a meeting with the American camp commander. The room was large and sterile, with high ceilings and long tables lined with papers and maps. The commander, a tall man with a calm demeanor, spoke to them in clear, measured tones. He explained the rules of the camp, the regulations they were expected to follow, and what they could expect from their time in captivity. There were no threats, no harsh words. Instead, the commander offered a level of respect that the officers had not anticipated. He made it clear that their treatment would follow the guidelines set out by the Geneva Conventions, and that their well-being would be taken into account. As the meeting progressed, the officers began to notice something else. The American officer, while firm in his authority, was not above engaging in small talk. He asked about their homes, about their families, about their lives before the war. It was a subtle, almost awkward attempt at conversation, but it was there. It was as though the commander was trying to humanize them, to make them feel less like prisoners and more like individuals. For the officers, this was a shock. They had never experienced such behavior from their own officers, let alone their enemies. After the meeting, the officers filed out of the room, exchanging quiet words with one another. They were still prisoners, but for the first time, they began to question the narrative they had been taught. Could it be that the Americans were not the heartless enemies they had imagined? Could it be that there was kindness even in a place like this? These questions began to linger in their minds, challenging everything they had once believed. That evening, as they sat down for their meal, the familiar tray of food was placed in front of them. The same bland soup, the same tough bread, but now there was something different. The officers no longer just ate in silence. They began to talk, to share their thoughts and observations about the camp, about their captors, and about the strange new world they were living in. They spoke in hushed tones, as if not quite ready to admit to themselves that they were beginning to see the humanity in their situation. The plastic cheese that had once been a symbol of mockery now sat on their plates, a small, almost insignificant detail, but one that marked the shift in their perception. It was just cheese after all, and maybe, just maybe, they had been wrong to laugh. As the days turned into weeks, the German officers began to adjust to the rhythm of camp life. The initial shock of captivity had worn off, and while they still longed for the certainty of their old lives, they now had to navigate the complexities of their new reality. The routine of the camp was strict, with each officer expected to follow a schedule that included work details, exercise, and meals. It wasn't much, but it was predictable, and in a life that had been turned upside down, predictability was a small comfort. Their work assignments were mundane, sorting through supplies, cleaning the camp, and other menial tasks, but they took them seriously. They had always prided themselves on their discipline, and in the absence of a battlefield, they threw themselves into these tasks with a sense of duty. At first, they resented the work. It felt beneath them, a far cry from the command positions they had once held. But over time, something began to shift. They realized that the physical labor, the simple tasks, gave their minds a break from the constant weight of captivity. It was easier to cope with the situation when there was something to focus on, even if it was as mundane as sweeping a floor or moving boxes. In the evenings, the officers gathered in their barracks, sitting in silence or talking quietly among themselves. They had little to do in the long hours before lights out, and the walls of their rooms, bare and impersonal, seemed to close in around them. Yet, the conversations that started hesitantly soon became more frequent. They discussed the camp, their old lives, and the war. They began to open up in ways they hadn't done in years. The bonds they had once shared as comrades in arms were now being replaced by a shared experience of captivity. There was no pride in it, but there was understanding. They were all in the same boat, and for the first time, they realized that they were not so different from the men they had once fought against. It was during these conversations that the officers began to understand the subtle kindness of their captors. The American guards, though firm in their duties, often showed small acts of consideration. A cup of coffee offered during a cold morning, a word of encouragement when they looked weary. These gestures, while simple, spoke volumes. The officers had expected hostility, or at best, indifference, but instead they were met with respect. It was a complicated feeling for them. They had been taught to see the Americans as their enemies, but here, in this strange camp, the lines were beginning to blur. The realization that their captors were human beings too was disorienting. But it was not just the guards who were extending kindness. The camp cook, Sam, who had initially been the subject of their ridicule, became a figure of unexpected importance in their daily lives. Though they had mocked his food at first, the officers soon found themselves eating it out of necessity. Over time, they started to appreciate the effort he put into preparing each meal. It wasn't gourmet, but it was sustenance, and there was something undeniably comforting about the meals he served. Even the dreaded plastic cheese, once the object of their scorn, began to lose its ridiculous edge. They ate it because they had to, and after a while, it just became part of the routine. The officers couldn't help but notice how Sam moved around the kitchen with quiet confidence, his hands steady as he prepared the meals. He seemed to take pride in his work, and though he rarely spoke to the prisoners, there was a certain warmth in his actions. They began to look forward to their meals, not just for the food itself, but for the familiarity of Sam's presence. It was a small thing, but it helped them feel more connected to the world around them, even if it was through something as simple as a meal. As the weeks passed, the officers found themselves growing accustomed to the camp's food, even the infamous plastic cheese. It wasn't delicious, but it wasn't terrible either. They had learned to live with it, just as they had learned to live with the other aspects of their captivity. The anger and resistance that had marked their initial reactions to the camp began to fade. It wasn't surrender exactly, but a kind of weary acceptance. They realized that they were not going anywhere, at least not in the immediate future, and the only way to endure the endless days was to find a way to make peace with their surroundings. One afternoon, while sitting together in the mess hall, the officers shared a quiet laugh over the cheese once again. It was a bitter laugh, tinged with irony, but it marked a shift in their attitudes. The laughter was no longer mocking, but resigned, as if they had come to terms with the absurdity of the situation. They were no longer fighting against the cheese, or the food, or even the camp itself. They had accepted it as part of their new reality, a reality they had no choice but to face. By now, the officers had also begun to adapt to the American customs they encountered. They had learned to appreciate the simplicity of the meals, the politeness of the guards, and even the oddities of the American way of life. It was all strange, yes, but it was also strangely comforting. The rigidity of their former lives had been replaced by a kind of fluidity they hadn't known existed. They were no longer officers, no longer soldiers. They were men, prisoners, and in that new identity they had to find a way to survive, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. And so the officers carried on, day by day, learning to live with the small, unexpected kindnesses that their captors offered. The American cheese, which had once been the subject of mockery, became a symbol of this strange, complicated process of adaptation. It wasn't just the food that changed, it was the officers themselves. They had entered the camp as prisoners of war, but over time they began to understand that captivity was not just a physical state, it was a mental one too. And to survive, they would need to change, just as the food on their plates had. The days at the camp continued to stretch out before the German officers, each one blending into the next like the endless rows of barracks and guard towers. At first, the officers had tried to maintain a semblance of their former selves, keeping their heads held high, their chins up, as if to assert that they were still in control of their lives. But as the weeks wore on, that facade began to crack. It wasn't just the routine that wore them down. It was the realization that their lives were no longer theirs to command. They were at the mercy of their captors, and despite the dignity they tried to uphold, it felt as though that dignity was slowly slipping away. The officers had initially dismissed their captors as unworthy of attention, seeing them as mere instruments of their captivity. But the more they observed, the more they realized that these American soldiers were not what they had imagined. The guards were not the bloodthirsty monsters they had expected, but men who performed their duties with a calm professionalism. There was no cruelty in their actions, no harshness in their words. They did not revel in the power that their uniforms gave them. Instead, they carried out their work with a quiet efficiency, as though they too were simply going through the motions of a routine they had no control over. It was a sobering thought for the officers, who had been taught to see their enemies as either weak or barbaric. This realization was particularly striking when one officer, a tall man named Klaus, began to form an unexpected bond with one of the American guards. Klaus had always been the most reserved of the group, keeping to himself, observing the world with a detached eye. But one day, as he worked with a guard on a routine task, he found himself struck by how much the man resembled someone from his past, an old comrade from the war. They both moved in the same way, with a quiet determination. And for a brief moment, Klaus saw in the guard's eyes a reflection of his own struggles, his own weariness. This was a moment that would linger with him for a long time, and it marked the beginning of a shift in his perception of the Americans. It was during this period that the officers began to notice the subtle gestures of kindness they had initially overlooked. The camp's food, while simple and far from the standard they had been used to, was always served with care. The cooks, led by Sam Washington, never skipped a beat, providing hearty portions of food each day. It wasn't gourmet, but there was something undeniably human in the way it was prepared. The officers, once dismissive of the food, now found themselves eating with more respect. The plastic cheese that had once drawn laughter now seemed like a small comfort, a reminder that survival was more about adaptation than pride. Sam's presence in the kitchen, though silent, became a subtle anchor for the officers, offering them a glimpse of a world outside their own grim existence. But it wasn't just the food that changed their perception. Small acts of kindness were becoming more common. One morning, as the officers lined up for roll call, one of the guards noticed Klaus's boots were in need of repair. Without a word, the guard offered him a spare pair of laces and helped him tie them properly. It was such a simple gesture, but to Klaus it felt like an unspoken acknowledgement of his humanity. In that moment, he realized that this guard, despite being on the opposite side of the war, saw him as more than just a prisoner. It was a humbling experience, and Klaus found himself struggling to reconcile this new image of the Americans with the hatred he had been taught. As the weeks passed, the officers found themselves facing a different kind of struggle. It wasn't just the physical toll of captivity that wore on them, it was the mental toll. They had been trained to endure hardship, to survive in the face of adversity, but they had never been trained for this kind of emotional battle. The humiliation of captivity, the loss of their former status, the slow erosion of their identity, it all weighed on them. And yet there was a strange comfort in the monotony of the days. The routines, though rigid, provided a sense of structure that the officers had come to rely on. It was a small victory in a world where they had little control. One afternoon, as the officers sat in the barracks, talking quietly among themselves, they began to reflect on the past. They spoke of their homes, of their families, of the lives they had left behind. It was a conversation they had avoided at first, fearful that such talk would only serve to remind them of their loss. But now it seemed necessary. It was as though the act of speaking about the past, of remembering what had once been, helped them hold on to their sense of self. The officers were prisoners, but they were still men with memories, with hopes, and with dreams. And as they shared their stories, something began to shift within them. They began to see each other not just as fellow officers, but as men who had experienced the same suffering, the same pain. That evening, as the officers sat down for their meal, the atmosphere in the mess hall was different. The usual silence had been replaced by quiet conversation. The laughter that had once been mocking was now genuine, though subdued. The officers had come to accept the strangeness of their new reality. The plastic cheese was still there, sitting on their trays, but it no longer held the same significance. It was just food, a small part of their survival. The real challenge lay in accepting their captivity, in finding a way to live with the uncertainty of their situation. And as they ate, they realized that this too was part of their journey. They were no longer just prisoners, they were survivors, and that, in itself, was a victory. It was in this moment of reflection that the officers fully understood the complexity of their situation. They were not just at the mercy of their captors, they were at the mercy of themselves. It was their ability to adapt, to find meaning in the smallest of things that would determine how they endured. They had spent so long focusing on the things they had lost, honor, power, status, that they had forgotten to look at what they still had. They still had each other, they still had their minds, and they still had the will to survive. That evening, as they finished their meal and returned to their barracks, they felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope. By the time the cold weather of November settled in, the camp had begun to take on a strange, almost eerie sense of normalcy. The officers had grown accustomed to the routines, the guards, and the simple, though often unsatisfying meals. But despite the outward appearance of calm, there was an undercurrent of unease, a tension that had begun to build among the prisoners. They had been in captivity for months now, and while they had managed to adapt to their new lives, the reality of their situation was beginning to weigh on them more heavily than ever before. Klaus, who had been one of the most stoic of the officers, found himself particularly affected by the passing of time. His thoughts often drifted back to his family in Germany. He had not heard from them since the war had escalated, and every day that passed without any word felt like another small death. It was not just the physical separation that troubled him, it was the uncertainty. He wondered if they were safe, if they were even alive. The lack of communication gnawed at him, leaving him restless and agitated. Even as he sat with his fellow officers during meals, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping away from him. The camp, too, had become a reminder of all that they had lost. The cold barracks, the constant vigilance of the guards, the bland meals, these were all symbols of their defeat, of a life they could never return to. And yet, in the midst of this, there was something else. The longer they stayed in the camp, the more the officers began to see the small acts of kindness that had been extended to them. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make them reconsider their previous judgment of their captors. They had expected nothing but cruelty, but what they had received instead was a kind of indifferent professionalism, and in some cases, even compassion. The guards didn't seem to take pleasure in their captivity, and while they were still enemies, there was a strange, reluctant understanding beginning to form between them and the officers. One evening, as the officers sat around a small fire in the camp's common area, they began to speak more openly about their families and their losses. It was a quiet conversation, interrupted only by the crackle of the fire. They spoke of their wives, their children, the homes they had left behind. Some of them had not even had the chance to say goodbye. The weight of this unspoken grief hung heavily in the air, and for the first time since they had arrived at the camp, they allowed themselves to mourn. It was a strange feeling, this permission to grieve. They were still prisoners, still soldiers, but in that moment they were simply men, men who had lost so much. The conversation drifted into silence. Klaus stood up and walked to the edge of the camp, staring out into the distance. The wind was cold, biting, but it cleared his mind. He thought of his wife, Anna, of the last time he had seen her. It had been during a brief leave, before the war had consumed them both. He could still remember the look in her eyes as they parted, fear, sadness, and a kind of helplessness. He had promised her that he would return, but now, with each passing day, that promise felt more like a distant memory. The uncertainty of her fate, of his family's fate, was becoming unbearable. Klaus's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see one of the American guards approaching him, a young man with a gentle face. The guard, whom Klaus had seen around the camp but never spoken to, stopped a few feet away and nodded in greeting. Klaus didn't know what to say at first, but after a moment he found his voice. "You have family?" he asked, his words a bit more abrupt than he intended. The guard nodded, his expression softening. "Yes," he replied. "I have a wife and a little boy back home in Ohio. Haven't seen them in a long time. Not sure when I will either." Klaus studied the guard for a moment, seeing the same weariness in his eyes that he felt in his own heart. The officer had always thought of the guards as faceless, nameless enemies, but now he realized that they too carried the burden of the war. They were not immune to the pain of separation, of loss. For a brief moment, Klaus felt a pang of sympathy for the young man. They were all just pawns in a game they hadn't chosen to play. The conversation was short, but it marked a shift in Klaus's thinking. He had been so focused on his own suffering, his own fears, that he had failed to see the humanity in those who held him captive. They too were caught in the machinery of war, just as he was. The line between captor and captive had always seemed so clear, but now it was becoming blurred. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. It was a reminder that, in the end, they were all just people, struggling to survive in a world that had been torn apart by conflict. The next day, Klaus and the other officers were summoned to the mess hall for their usual meal. As they sat down to eat, Klaus found that his mind was no longer focused on the food, or even on the American cheese that had once seemed so ridiculous. Instead, he found himself looking around the room, taking in the faces of the guards and the prisoners. The guards, too, had their own stories, their own losses. And though they were on opposite sides of the war, they were all bound by the same human experiences: grief, fear, and the longing for something better. For the first time since his capture, Klaus didn't feel entirely alone. He was still a prisoner, still trapped in a foreign land, but the sense of isolation that had plagued him for so long began to fade. There was a strange kind of solidarity that came with understanding that no matter the uniforms they wore or the roles they played, they were all just people, trying to make sense of a world that had been broken. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to hold on to. As winter began to tighten its grip on the camp, the daily routines continued without much variation. The German officers, having long since adjusted to their roles as prisoners, found themselves settling into a strange form of acceptance. The bitterness that had once filled their hearts, the anger toward their captors, and the unfairness of their situation had softened, replaced by a kind of quiet resignation. They still harbored hope of an eventual end to their captivity, but now it was a distant hope, one that didn't consume them as it once had. Instead, they had learned to live in the moment, finding small comforts in their new life. It was during this period of relative calm that Klaus received a letter from home. It was a simple letter, written in the hurried, somewhat illegible handwriting of his younger sister, Ingrid. The news it carried was far from good. His family's farm had been destroyed in an air raid, and though his parents were alive, they had been forced to flee to a safer area. His wife, Anna, had not been heard from in months. The letter was filled with vague details, the kind of information that left more questions than answers. Klaus had read it through several times, the words blurring together as his mind struggled to process the information. He had hoped for something more concrete, something to cling to, but instead he was left with the same overwhelming uncertainty that had haunted him since his capture. The weight of the letter seemed to hang over him for days. His thoughts constantly drifted back to his family, to the life he had left behind. The fear that had once felt so distant now felt all too real. He had known, deep down, that they might be gone, but receiving confirmation was a different kind of pain. It was a loss that felt both permanent and unbearable, a kind of grief that couldn't be put into words. The officer had always prided himself on his ability to remain composed, but now he felt like a shell of the man he had once been. He was no longer sure who he was or what he was fighting for. That evening, as Klaus sat alone in the mess hall, staring down at his empty plate, he felt the weight of the camp press down on him. It wasn't the physical discomfort of captivity that bothered him anymore. It was the emotional toll, the sense of isolation that gnawed at him in the silence of the night. He had tried to maintain his dignity, to keep up the pretense that he was still a soldier, still a man of honor. But the truth was that he had lost so much, and he didn't know how to find a way back from it. He missed his family, his home, the life he had once taken for granted. As he sat in his thoughts, one of the American guards approached him, a young man who had become somewhat of a fixture in the camp. The guard had been kind to Klaus in small, quiet ways, offering him a cigarette or a few words of comfort now and then. They had never spoken much, but there was an understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement of their shared humanity. The guard sat down across from Klaus, his face betraying a hint of concern. Klaus hadn't expected to have this conversation, but somehow it felt like the right moment. "I heard from the others that you got news," the guard said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Klaus pause. "I know it's not easy. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Klaus looked up, surprised by the guard's sincerity. He had expected sympathy, perhaps, but it felt different coming from a man who had once been his enemy. There was no mockery in the guard's voice, no condescension, just genuine empathy. It was the first time since his capture that Klaus had felt a connection, however brief, with one of the men who had held him captive. It was an unexpected kindness, and for a moment it made the camp seem less oppressive, less isolating. "Thank you," Klaus muttered, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't sure what else to say. The words felt inadequate, but it was all he could muster. It was the first time he had truly acknowledged the loss he had suffered, not just to his fellow officers, but to someone outside his circle. The guard nodded and stood up, his posture still stiff, but there was a softness in his eyes that wasn't there before. As the guard walked away, Klaus felt a strange sense of relief, as though something inside him had shifted. It wasn't a monumental change, but it was enough to make him realize that he wasn't as alone as he had thought. The guards, the soldiers, while they remained his captors, were also human. They had their own burdens, their own struggles. In that moment, Klaus understood that the enemy was not just the man across the battlefield. Sometimes the enemy was the very system that bound them all. The war had taken so much from him, but it was moments like this that reminded him that there was still something worth holding on to. The next few days passed in a haze for Klaus. He spent more time in the barracks, staring out the small window at the bleak landscape beyond. The cold had set in, the wind biting through the thin walls of the camp. But the chill he felt inside was far worse than the weather. It was the cold of loss, of uncertainty, of a future he couldn't see. Yet, as he sat in the quiet of his thoughts, he realized that he wasn't entirely powerless. There were still small things that could be controlled, moments of connection that, though fleeting, were more powerful than he had ever realized. The following week, as the officers gathered for their usual meal, Klaus found himself looking at the plastic cheese with a new sense of clarity. It was still the same bland food, still the same reminder of their captivity. But this time, it didn't feel as insignificant. It was part of their shared experience now, part of the world they had to navigate together. The cheese, once a symbol of mockery, was now a symbol of survival. And that, Klaus thought, was enough for now. It wasn't the life he had imagined, but it was the life he had left, and he was going to find a way to make peace with it.